My name is Joyce New. I'm the Executive Director of the Joan Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice here at the University of San Diego. And together with my colleagues, I would like to welcome you. If this is your first time here or whether you've been here many times, we're very happy to see you here and hope you'll be back. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a special program of the Institute. It was endowed by Joan Kroc a couple of years ago with the goal to bring in world leaders to discuss issues of concern, issues that were topical and relevant to our national and international community. Tonight's talk by the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy is The Responsibility to Protect, Prescription for a Global Public Domain. The Distinguished Lecture Series is just one of the programs at the Institute. The Institute has a number of other programs, and you have some information, I believe, in your program about those. Other programs are not as happily funded in all cases as the Distinguished Lecture Series, and so we welcome your support to enable us to continue work with our projects in Nepal, Uganda, our women peacemakers, especially programs like our intern program that brings in students from around the world to work and study alongside of us at the Institute. And even before they get to be university students, we work with high school students in San Diego and Baja California in a program called WorldLink, which is directed by my colleague Shelley Lyford. And so we ask for your support, and I believe there are donor cards in your programs this evening to make this easy for you to become an Institute supporter. So it's my pleasure this evening to welcome Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, and in fact to welcome also his wife, Denise, to speak to us today on the responsibility to protect. Dr. Axworthy is currently the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg and has had a distinguished career in public service, as you can see from the biography that is printed in your program. In his last government position as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Axworthy's commitment to human rights, democracy, and peace building gave a shove to the international community that resulted in pushing forward international instruments and mechanisms, such as the Ottawa Treaty that banned anti-personnel landmines and the new International Criminal Court that will hold perpetrators of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity accountable. His recent book, Navigating a New World, published by Vintage Press in August 2004, draws on his experiences as Minister of Foreign Affairs and advances recommendations for human security that focus on the welfare of people. Dr. Axworthy has been an outspoken advocate on human rights and on nations' accountability to protect their citizens from war and injustice. I met Dr. Axworthy in the late 1990s when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I was at a working meeting up in Ottawa looking at the prevention of deadly conflict. And one of the issues we were discussing at the time was the case of Kosovo. And I remember that Dr. Axworthy joined us one afternoon for the session, and I think all of us in that room, there were maybe 15, I don't know, it was not a very large group, were incredibly impressed because he walked in and instead of telling us what the government's position was on Kosovo, he actually asked us questions. What did we think? What were our views on what was happening? What were our views on the way out of the crisis in Kosovo? So he was really a listener, and we were, again, very impressed that someone would take the time to come into this meeting and listen and be open to the different views that were expressed in that room. After reading Dr. Axworthy's installation address that he gave at the University of Winnipeg this past June, it's clear that he really is a listener, a learner, and a powerful leader. In taking the position of President of the University of Winnipeg, his undergraduate alma mater, it may be that Dr. Axworthy has not only come home, but has found his true niche as an academic policymaker. And I'm reminded of something that President Carter always used to say, which was, he said that he used the presidency as a stepping stone to become the chair of the Carter Center. And I think that Dr. Axworthy has used his experience in government to come home and be an academic leader at the University of Winnipeg. For those of us here at the University of San Diego, when you read what he wrote, what he said during this address to the University of Winnipeg, it sounds as if he has read the mission of the University of San Diego. He talks about service, compassion, diversity, and inclusivity. For Dr. Axworthy speaks of shaping new, equitable, and sustainable urban environments, of opening the door to Aboriginal people, of inspiring young people to a life of public service. He says that you can't manage a world fraught with risks with old institutions. And so universities must light the way forward by being innovators, conveners, educators, counselors, and good neighbors. He urges all students to accept the challenge to become global citizens. Dr. Axworthy, in this day and age, is still not afraid to be an idealist, but he has the rare ability to translate idealism into actions that have ripple effects across the world and have made our global community a more humane and decent place to be. It's a great honor to welcome Dr. Axworthy.
Joyce, thank you very much for those very kind words, and good evening, everyone. I was particularly intrigued by your commentary about my new day job as a president of a university and the high ideals to which I aspire. In arriving there, I discovered, however, that I was told quickly my task was to get the tuitions down for the students, get free parking for the faculty, and a good basketball team for the alumni. So, and speaking of that, I would like to, Elena, thank Mayor Murphy, through you, for his kind regards and for the honor given to me as becoming a citizen of San Diego. I did read your paper this morning. And I hope this carries no financial liabilities in any way. I'm also hoping it gets me a discount at the zoo tomorrow when we visit. But thank you very much. It is a great honor. It's great to be here at the University of San Diego, where I already feel, after a very short time, a sense of companionship. Our two universities really derive their roots from colleges that had a religious base and therefore still feel deeply that values are part of the educational experience and are also committed to being institutions, particularly the one that we're in tonight, that believes that you can translate ideas into action. And that, I think, is a very strong calling. I should also acknowledge in the audience a good friend of mine, Pat Bro, who is a member of the President's Council from the University of San Diego. He is also the operator of the Port of Churchill in northern Manitoba, which, if global warming continues, will be the new Antwerp of North America. So we're very, very pleased to have him here. And I really am very pleased that so many of you have come to join me tonight in what I hope will be a good conversation. I was told again, in becoming a president of a university, that it was a little bit like being a caretaker in a cemetery. There was lots of people under me, but nobody would listen. So the idea of actually having an audience tonight is, and by the way, they were right. So I really welcome the chance to sort of be with you this evening, to have some listening going on and some speaking and sharing, because I have always felt in 30 some odd years I spent in the Canadian Parliament and various areas where I had, as you can imagine, a number of contacts with this country, and spent 5 years as a graduate student here, that we really have to have more of a discussion and a dialogue and get to know each other much better. I do recall that the Prime Minister at one point was planning a speaking tour in the United States and said he wanted to get some survey materials to what Americans thought about us. And he instructed me to go out and hire the best firm we could to kind of do a sampling of American attitudes. And I got the results back and immediately put them in that kind of bottom drawer with a lock on it. And after a while, he started pestering me, saying, "All right, Lloyd, where are the results? I'm launching on my tour." And I could say, "Oh, Prime Minister, I don't think you really want to sort of study. Why don't you just do this kind of spontaneously?" No, he kept insisting. So what I was trying to hide from his sort of political perception was the question was asked as to who was the best known Canadian in the United States. And the answer was not Jean Chrétien, it was Pamela Lee Anderson. And when I showed him that, he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, they probably see more of her than they see of you." So along the way. And I've since found out that there's been something less than a wildly enthusiastic reception for Canadian views in the last year. I was watching one night an interview given by Ann Coulter, who I gather is one of the well-known authors of political fiction in the United States, who said, the Canadians are lucky that we allow them to coexist with us on the continent. I was never quite sure I called it luck. I mean, I was never quite sure that was the word I would use. And then another one of the sort of distinguished commentators on Fox News, Tucker Carlson, I think is that name, said that Canada was like Honduras, only a little bit colder and not nearly as interesting. So, as you can imagine, in my days as a foreign minister, I had to spend a lot of time sort of working out sort of these interesting and important relationships we have as we shared this fascinating piece of geography called North America. But we always were under some restraints because while I don't think the folks at Fox News were paying much attention, people in the State Department were. So I was always very precise, really calibrated my words with great precision when I sort of felt that I had to speak. So when I left government, I felt liberated. I felt now I could kind of throw away the briefing notes and get away from all the sort of do's and don'ts. So one of my first ventures was to be asked to speak at a university in Taiwan. And I gave my little talk, and a nice young man at the end of it got up and said, "Well, look, Dr. Axworthy, you were foreign minister for Canada for 5 years. You lived next door to the most powerful country in the world. We live next door to a powerful country. Do you have any advice on how to deal with this border?" Well, I kind of looked down, and the briefing notes weren't there anymore. I was kind of on my own, so I fell back on an old saying that we have in the province of Manitoba. I said, "Well, it's a little like making love to a porcupine. Do it carefully." I don't think it translates into Chinese all that well. In fact, I was pretty sure that it did, because the next morning I was asked to one of these power breakfasts. You go to in Taipei, you get up at 5 in the morning, and and I was supposed to go there and talk about trade and all these things. And when I get in the room, there was a slightly awkward kind of response. I mean, the body language wasn't exactly warm and cuddly, and actually nobody was looking at me. And so I said to my host, I said, "Have I committed some problem with protocol here? Have I done?" He said, "Well, it may have something to do with the story in this morning's newspaper." And I said, "Well, what did it say?" Because my Chinese wasn't that good. And he said, "Well, it quoted you as saying, when asked how you would recommend us getting along with sort of the China mainland or with the United States, your answer was, it's like making love to a concubine." So if any of you thought you were coming tonight to get a really sort of hard-nosed analysis of international affairs, my newfound liberation may come as a disappointment. But I'll tell you what it does do. It has made me reflect on this question of borders, how you get along with them, how you deal with them, particularly increasingly when we live in a borderless world. As you might have read in the program, in the last year I've been an envoy for the United Nations Secretary General, but in Ethiopia, Eritrea, where there has been a border dispute which 4 years ago resulted in hundreds of, about 100,000 killed and wounded in a very tough war. And since then there's been a stalemate in any resolution to that conflict. And so I spend every 2 or 3 months having to try to work with the leaders of the two countries to find some way in which this border dispute, a line drawn in the sand between two countries, can be resolved so that both can get on with the important tasks of helping to redeem sort of the difficult economic situation of their people and to begin developing more of a regional stability and all the things that you're supposed to do at the UN. And one of the things that I thought was most sort of disturbing and unsettling about this border problem was a report that the World Bank delivered that showed that the inability to resolve the border resulted in some 15 to 18 million people in both countries being sort of falling below the poverty line, which in both countries is about $200 at best anyway. And you're sort of saying, what is it in the pride and prejudice that leads respective governments to put so much currency into the defense of this border when in fact the real issue, the real tough, important issue was the deplorable state that many people were in, how the solution to this, the ability to reach across the border, would result in an enormous upsurge of development and trade and commerce and in security and investment, the things that I think were most prized and most important to the people of that area. And I think it's fair to say that they are not alone, that borders still sort of represent, for virtually all of us, 200 years of history of borders being the substantial and dominant factor and feature of our international life. And certainly, as a northern neighbor who sort of winced and sympathized with your own country after 9/11 and realized how the question of borders became once again so dominant and so important, we realize that it is still the touchstone that determines and shapes so much of our discourse and so much of our action. And yet at the same time, as I was coming back from my trip to Ethiopia just in the early part of January, just as we were all sort of reeling in the impact of the tsunami event in Southeast Asia, it drew very clearly in my mind that for all the preoccupation with borders, we were living in a borderless world. Here was a calamity of enormous significance that didn't recognize borders. 11 countries, affecting over 100 nationals from different areas and regions. And that the response, the ability to be able to protect those people did not rely upon individual governments sort of getting sort of their act together. It was simply a phenomenon that had become a global in its reach, and even, perhaps even more dramatic, global in its response. It was fascinating, I think, to watch the way in which the publics of different countries drove their governments into a more active and engaged involvement. That it was not led by the leaders of the state, it was led from the grassroots of sort of school children sort of selling pizzas and service clubs holding special events and universities sort of holding vigils. I mean, it was a real example of a global grassroots movement that said we've got to respond. And there's the dichotomy that we live with. Day in and day out, there's this balance between the border and the borderless worlds. And that's really one of the key questions that I wanted to address tonight a little bit in the issue of how do you resolve it? How do you begin to make sense, and how do you begin to build upon that new phenomenon that was so much part of it, especially when you think of the fact that we are living in a world which is very much influenced by the existence of a global underworld. When I came into foreign affairs in the mid-90s in Canada, the first mandate, you get a letter from the Prime Minister saying, here's your job, and the first one is to protect Canadians. And that's what it said, first paragraph. All of a sudden I realized, how do I protect them when, tens of thousands are traveling as tourists or as students or as business people? How do I sort of protect them against the drug cartels or the terrorists or the criminals within my own range and influence as a leader of a national government? And therefore it dawned on me pretty quickly, I better find some friends, we better collaborate, we better find some way of connecting and hooking up and building networks so that even for the simple task that I was facing as part of my mandate to protect my own citizens, I couldn't do it alone. Neither could we as a government do it alone. And I recall quite vividly, I know sort of that this institute has been very deeply involved in northern Uganda, where I've also spent some time over the years. But last year I was asked by Human Rights Watch to lead a mission to Colombia to table a report on child soldiers. And the report was sort of titled, "You'll Learn Not to Cry." And I always feel, I think as many of you do, that the best way of explaining the way the world is through stories. I mean, it's not the soliloquy of the state, it's the human story that really counts. And when we got to Bogota and the report, we met a number of the young children who had been child soldiers and who were really the authors of this report, because it was based upon their experiences. This was the opening preface. I hope you don't mind my just recounting it for a moment. This was the story of Angela, who had been taken away from her village in the northeast corner of Colombia at the age of 12. And this is what she had said. She said, "I had a friend, Juanita, who got into trouble. We'd been friends in civilian life. We shared a tent together. We were taken into the camps of the rebels together. And she got into trouble. She tried to escape and was captured. The commander said to me that it didn't matter as my friend. She had committed an error and had to be killed. And I was the one to do it. I closed my eyes and fired the gun, but I didn't hit her, so the commander said I had to shoot her again. So I did. The grave was nearby. I had to bury her and put dirt on top of her and say a prayer. Afterwards, the commander said, "Angela, you did quite well, even though you started to cry. You'll have to do this again many more times until you learn not to cry." In a way, that summed up for me, in part, the kind of borderless world we live in, because this young girl, and it's a story that's repeated 1,000 times a day in 100 places around the world, was being faced by a predator who had taken advantage of her innocence, had turned her into a warrior, put a horrible test on her, and at the age of 12, she was having to tell her story. Can you imagine? When you see your own children or grandchildren, just what kind of wrenching trauma that must have caused. But it could be told over again in Congo or Darfur or northern Uganda by the same kind of children in many places. And on the way back from Bogota, as I was sort of still being much affected by this, I sort of met a Canadian businessman, a mining engineer who was flying back to Vancouver. And his question to me, he said, "Well, I read about your mission here in the paper." He was very, very honest. He said, "What's that got to do with us? Tell me why we should really be committed. This is Colombia's problem, after all." Until I reminded them that the same drug cartels that were behind these groups who had kidnapped Angela and Juanita were also the same drug cartels that were distributing hard crack on the streets of East Side Vancouver, and where we had 30 young people a month ODing so that they could be part of their global network of distribution and supply. In fact, the same cartels that last year had a profit margin of $15 billion, which exceeds the gross national product of about three-quarters of the world's countries. And it simply showed that we weren't immune, that maybe they weren't kidnapping our young Aboriginal girls off the street of Hastings Street in Vancouver, but we were killing them nonetheless. And therefore, we were as much responsible for coming to grips with those issues as were the authorities in Colombia. And I've been reminded about the book that was published just before her death by Susan Sontag, where she says we must regard the pain of others, and talks about how the quintessential experience of being in the modern world is looking at calamity. Looking at the calamity which oftentimes simply gets deposited in our mental membrane or gets archived somewhere in our recess of memory, and after the first flush of indignation or response simply becomes part of that collection, and as much as all of us were deeply affected by the horrible events in Southeast Asia, it tended to cloud and shadow what had taken place months before, where 100,000 people were being ethnically killed in Darfur and 2 million forced into refugee camps. Or how many more images have we absorbed and dealt with, and how much have we, in many cases, ignored it? As we were talking about, as you were, about the role of a university, my university is in a downtown part of a city where the Aboriginal sort of population has grown substantially, and they are scarred deeply by their experience in residential schools to the point where they too have lost their identity and who they are. And that's why Sontag said, you know, it is important that we take some time to stand aside and think about the pain of others, because that pain is ours. And I think, at least in my own limited experience, that there is an appetite amongst our populations to do that. When I published my book last year, I got to go on one of those sort of magical mystery tours, you know, that where you end up sort of doing hotline shows at 6 a.m. explaining globalization somewhere between the weather and the hockey scores. And I was fortunate enough to visit some American cities where we had the same experience. And I got to tell you, everywhere I went, I got a sense that the people did feel an urge. They wanted to respond, weren't sure how, and felt increasingly disconnected from the traditional channels of government and politics and things that I had grown up in. I mean, I was part of that system for 30 years. And I felt that we were doing a job, and all of a sudden I realized that for many people, they were feeling that what was happening out there in the world was not being directly communicated or connected to who they were, what their lives were, what they were trying to say. And it reminded me of the sort of comment by the Jesuit theologian Teilhard de Chardin, who said, a great many internal and external portents have caused us all to feel more or less confusedly that something tremendous is taking place. But what is it? What is it? Let me try to address some of those questions about what is it, because I think it behooves us in the sense of being in a university where the search and the exploration, the navigation of what is it, is in many ways our prime responsibility. And I learned this the tough way, because as a foreign minister, I was basically a plumber. I was fixing leaks every day. I didn't have much to do with the architecture of how it worked. But I began to realize, as I sort of was being asked to fix those leaks, that if I didn't have an idea, if I didn't have some sense of a core commitment about what I felt was happening, we were simply sort of responsive and reactive. We weren't really giving direction. I wasn't doing my job until I was able to try to address that in a way that gave some cohesion and some sense of place and positioning, so that as a community of people in the country, we Canadians could try to understand that what we were doing had some relationship, some relevance to what is it. So we came up with the concept. It wasn't ours originally. It was one unique. It really derived from a report the United Nations table in '94. But we took hold of the idea of human security as opposed to national security. And it's a very simple idea, horribly complicated and difficult to implement. But it was a simple idea saying that increasingly the issue of risk and threat is a risk and threat to people and individuals, not to nations and governments. That we were basically saying that the notion of sovereignty, as it had evolved over 200 and some odd years, was in itself still an essential ingredient, but in itself was not sufficient. National security was in itself not sufficient to protect people. And in fact, taken to extremes, taken to the outer edges, the preoccupation with national security could end up degrading the individual security of people. And so we played around and said, how does that apply to the kind of day-by-day operations, and how do we begin to make that a matter of direction? I recall, and I say this with some trepidation, that I was launching this idea at the University of Toronto, and one of our distinguished political scientists got up and said, well, Minister Axworthy, I may concede that human security works in practice, but does it really work in theory? Boy, that really threw me for a loop, I thought about. Probably drove me back to the university to find the answer. But what it really meant is that we began to put a different lens sort of on our perception of how the world worked. And that the only way that we could begin to assure the security based on a human dimension was to begin acting in a different way. It led, because we weren't great theorists, into very practical, sort of direct actions. As was described in my introduction, perhaps the one that I learned the strongest lessons from was the ability and the interest of a worldwide coalition of individuals to get a treaty to ban the use of landmines. It didn't start with governments. It actually started here in the United States with the Veterans for Vietnam Foundation, who young Americans coming back from that war experience and realizing just what a vicious sort of weapon that was, provided the money to set up a coalition, an international coalition. That was the origin of the landmine treaty, was here, and then people like Senator Pat Leahy from Vermont sort of picked it up and ran with it. And President Clinton actually, in his first address to the United Nations, made the case for a treaty on landmines. We said, well, you know, good enough for the Americans, got to be good enough for us. So. But more importantly, it was the direct contact with this fascinating constellation of people around the world, victims of landmines, so people who had tried to recover their countries, whether it was Cambodia or Mozambique or Nicaragua, after the war and conflict was over, tried to restore their agriculture or the forest, and all of a sudden when they walked into the unmarked pathway would have a leg blown off or that they would lose their life. And by the way, just to fast forward, it still exists. There are serious landmine fields between Ethiopia and Eritrea because we haven't been able to get an agreement to remove them. And every month or two, a shepherd, a nomad, a child is killed by a landmine or wounded. But that taught us a lesson, that there was a base of support and commitment to develop a human security approach. We ended up creating a group of 14 countries called the Human Security Network that tied ourselves very closely to an NGO network around the world, with the Red Cross institution. We had, for the first time, decisions were being made not through the formal structures of intergovernmental relations, but by a network who were simply working together, collaborating, building on each other, and beginning to find some way to get the answer. And so we began to say that that notion of how do you recalibrate public policy to the protection of individuals. Not that we ignored national security in a sense, we still had sort of armed forces and we were still prepared to commit, but we realized that there was more to it than that. And I got to tell you, the test, the real place where, to use the old expression, the rubber hit the road was when we came to Kosovo. Because as we were out extolling the need to provide protection for individuals, and we were members of the Security Council of the UN, and we brought in protocols for peacekeeping that said the responsibility of peacekeeping is not just to divide warring parties, but to protect civilians. We didn't want to see Rwanda happen again. We didn't want to see Srebrenica happening. We didn't want to see people with blue helmets standing aside while the local population was taken off to be murdered in a cave or a canyon somewhere with no protection. But then we hit Kosovo. And we knew all the reports coming in. You saw the kind of stuff that ethnic cleansing was taking place, no question about it. And we danced the diplomatic minuets. We had meetings all over the place. And we hit the question that at the Security Council we couldn't get an agreement to intervene because the Russians were going to veto. So you know the rest of the story. We went to NATO and we got engaged and eventually we got stopped the killing and slowly and fitfully have started the rebuilding of that country from the kind of divisions that the boundaries had created for so long. I didn't like what happened. We committed. I was asked by the Prime Minister to recommend to my cabinet whether we should get involved or not, and we did. Because I felt that I couldn't, with any honesty, stand up for a human security principle if I wasn't prepared to ultimately be faced with the choice of the ultimate use of force to protect people. You know, it's like a cop on the beat. The worst time you come is when they call your cards, and are you prepared to use it? But I didn't like the fact there were no rules. The decision was ad hoc. It bypassed the United Nations, so there wasn't a collective judgment. It did go into a NATO, which was, after all, a military alliance. And so I established a commission called Commission on Intervention and Sovereignty with the approval of the Secretary General, and we got a number of countries involved, and a number of major U.S. foundations helped support the research. I think it was a real attempt to come to grips, going back to what I talked about, of trying to get a hold of a new idea about how it could work in a way that would refurbish and rehabilitate the somewhat tattered position that the UN and we had all fallen into. And I'd say to you now that to me was perhaps, if I look back, one of the things that I was able to do that I think still carries some significance, because what happened is that the notion of human security has morphed into a new concept called the responsibility to protect. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, the Commission looked at this and said, if you go back into the roots of government, go back into 18th century sort of philosophes in France or Great Britain, in this country, who were looking at the role of the state and the relation of the individual to it, one primary purpose, and that's the protection of its citizens. Just have to recognize that my son Stephen showed up just in time to get the finale. I see. And what they're saying is, how do we extend that fundamental responsibility to protect into a global domain? How do you do it? They came up with a formula, and that said, if a state, if a government is incapable of protecting its own people, just doesn't have the wherewithal, it's a failed state, it runs the presidential palace and there's nothing beyond it. If there's a failed state, or if the government itself won't protect its people, or if the government of the state itself is the predator, is the one that's actually doing the killing or the cleansing, then the international community has a responsibility to protect. We turn sovereignty on its head. We basically say sovereignty is not a prerogative of the state, it's an earned right to provide protection for the citizens of a state, and if it doesn't fulfill that responsibility, that mandate, then there has to be some way of ensuring the protection takes place. And this doesn't mean some willful, capricious, let's walk in where we want to go. It means setting up a very high threshold of test. It's got to be genocide, it's got to be real murder, it's got to be real cleansing. It doesn't go in because you sort of make up reasons for it. There's got to be a real severe test, a clear, objective, hard-nosed test. There's got to be a collective decision-making on it. You also have to make sure that the means are appropriate to the crime. In Kosovo, we had some real scrambles with the military people who wanted to bomb. They are trained to win. We as foreign minister had to say, we're not out to win, we're out to stop and protect. And we went through some very tough discussions with our military commanders saying, you got to put some rules in. You have to use means appropriate to the objective and to the goal. In other words, the whole point about R2P, responsibility to protect, was that we were basically redefining the notion of the boundary, of sovereignty. Saying it doesn't stop ceasing. We're not talking about some kind of fantasy of world government. We're saying, of course, states have to exercise their responsibilities, but if they don't or can't or won't or are themselves are the violator of the basic rights of people to live in a freedom from fear and the right to exist, then somebody has to do it. But it's got to be done by rules of law and by proper process and by making sure that it is not an abuse of exercise. And this is not some abstract, some academic exercise of hypothetical simulations. Boy, this is real. Because the issue of intervention, of when and who and how goes in to influence the affairs of another state, is probably the most critical and difficult conundrum that we face in this new century of ours. And it's not easy to answer. I'm not saying that I'm coming up here with a fully described and widespread consensus on what we're going to go. It is debatable. There are still many of those who will simply say, We should exercise no restraints on our sovereignty. We have a right to do what we want within our own boundaries. We have a right to do what we need to do to protect ourselves in our own boundaries, which is where the whole issue of boundaries gets tied in with this issue of the borderless world that we live in. It's also, and I just give you this caution because I think it's important for an institute such as this and this university, which is clearly committed in terms of its willingness to engage in these issues. The responsibility to protect is the core principle behind the high panel on UN reform that was tabled just in December, which will form the basis of a major debate about the reformation of the United Nations system in the future. We finally recognized, that that old organization that was the brainchild of the Second World War, of Franklin Roosevelt and those who put the charter together, has served a purpose, but it wasn't dealing with the world the way it was. It lost enormous credibility over Iraq. It has been besieged by challenges of corruption in the oil for food program. In other words, it's an organization that needs some fresh air. And at the very core of it, at the very center of that discussion that the Secretary General is launching, in which all the world leaders will come to New York in 5 months, in September of this year, the responsibility to protect is a principle that will be debated deeply. And the question is, are we ready to do something about it? What does it mean, for example? Well, let me give you some examples of very specific consequences. If you even begin to take it as at least being partly credible, then it does lead to some very significant reforms. It means, for example, and I say this to an American audience, it means saying that the big powers of the Security Council, the P5, no longer should be able to use a veto when it comes to humanitarian intervention. Why the hell should China or why should the United States be able to do that? No? I'm not trying to be blasphemous, I'm just simply saying, why, in the case of Kosovo, should Russia and China have been in the way of a proper UN-organized involvement to stop the killing and cleansing of tens of thousands of people? And therefore, that is a major restraint. Will the big powers give it up? No. But they can be brought to bear on a new standard. The responsibility to protect is basically a new international norm, if you like. And I believe in norms. I think people do, because all of a sudden, if they begin to use a veto to stop an effort to protect people, then they're going to have to answer the question, why? What gave you the right to stop the kind of intervention that must be brought to bear in the western part of Sudan or many other places? What rationale have you? And all of a sudden, because there's a new norm out there. And that can, I think, should have or could have the same kind of emulsion that we saw in things like the deliberations over the landmine treaty and other efforts. It's got to be based on some serious work and deliberation and efforts to say, we're not asking you to get off the Security Council, we're not asking you to stop the veto if there's an aggression across your border, but don't use it when you're trying to save women and children. It means establishing serious commitments on international law. This is a country made up of the rule of law. And I don't want to be rude, but your present administration is doing everything it can to destroy the new institution called the International Court, which is based upon the rule of law. And many of us in Canada and around the world find that intolerable. We don't accept that. We don't. Because the rule of law is important for the stability, not only of the world, but I happen to think, and I'm not speaking ex cathedra, that in terms of a battle against terrorism, the International Criminal Court could become the center linchpin in an international judicial system that would hold people accountable. It would provide a deterrence. It provides a way of identifying the criminals, whether they're the Pol Pots or the Idi Amins or the Osama bin Ladens, and say, hey, man, you are going to be held judgmental. And it's going to be based upon rules of law, not upon individual decisions. I'm not saying it's the only answer, but let me just give you an example, a clear example of how I saw it work. In the case of Kosovo, we were sitting in some breezy, windy old castle in Germany trying to negotiate a peace deal with Milosevic. We weren't going anywhere. I mean, the Russians were sending envoys, and we were having conversations, and he was basically thumbing his nose. Until the tribunal for the Balkans, we got a message. We were over dinner one night, and Louise Arbour, who was the chief prosecutor, happened to be a country person of mine. I got a little note saying, Louise is going to indict Milosevic and 6 of his comrades. So I thought, as part of dinner time conversation, I'd share that with the other foreign ministers of the G8. I said, by the way, guess what's going to happen tomorrow? Well, you should say, oh, they said, oh God, you Canadians, you're doing it again. You're interfering, they'll never come to the table, da, 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 da. I said, look, you can grieve all you like and complain. Not much I can do about it. I know Louise Arbour, and if I phoned up and said, don't do it, Louise, I would be indicted, you know. So she did it. In 24 hours, Milosevic was at the table. 48 hours, we had a peace agreement. And 3 months later, he was whisked off to be held accountable for his crimes. Why? Why? Well, partly it's because, as we used to say in politics, because all of a sudden, those around him didn't want to be in the next Christmas card with him. He lost his base. He was indicted. He was a criminal. He no longer had the kind of aura that leaders have. You didn't want to be too close to Milosevic after the indictment. Today in Darfur, interesting issue. The commission that reported just last week clearly said that one of the most effective ways of stopping the killing, which is going on incessantly, and let's make the contrast that the number of casualties and victims in Western Sudan, and it's not the only place, in the last year has mounted up to about 35 World Trade attacks. A lot of innocent people have lost their lives based upon the inability of the world community to get their act together and protect. And the way to do it, says the Commission, and I, by the way, say to that the U.S. administration, I think, was very courageous in coming out and saying, this is genocide. Colin Powell's statement before Christmas saying, let's not accept it. Let's not sugarcoat, cotton candy this one. This is real, serious genocide. Deliberate policies by a government to eliminate a group of people. And so the UN set up a commission to examine it. They didn't quite come to the conclusion that it was genocide because they said there's some further evidence that has to be adduced, but it is a crime against humanity. And what should we do? Let's refer it, as the Security Council has every right to do under the Rome Statute, to the International Criminal Court, and say to the Sudanese leadership, in fact, there's a list of people who are already there, that you continue to commit crimes against humanity. You can continue to recruit child soldiers. You continue to use rape as a weapon of war. You continue to exterminate people or cleanse people. You will be indicted. And I got to tell you, the folks in Khartoum are terrified of that possibility. Nothing affects leaders more than to know that they're not going to go to London for this season's fashion show. They want to travel. They want to get out. I'm not being facetious. The toughest restraint and sanction you can put is not to stop supplies going in, not to stop food, or just simply say to the leadership, you're going to be indicted, meaning anywhere in the world you go, you can be held accountable, you can be tried, you'll be picked up by the government of that state, if it's Germany or France or the United States, wherever, except it's not in this country because the present government won't recognize that as being a legitimate tool. And so here you have a conundrum. The U.S. has taken the lead in Sudan and saying there's a real international crime going on, but because of their abhorrent objection to the court, won't agree to a reference from the Security Council, which could have a huge impact on stopping that crime against humanity. And that's what I mean by the responsibility to protect. I mean, that's what we're talking about. It changes the rules a little bit, it changes the equations, and it makes people start thinking in a different way about what their responsibilities are. And that's where I'm not here to sort of become a missionary. I'm simply saying that if you want to build up a set of rules about the way the world is going to work on this borderless issue, we better start doing it. Let me just give you a final example of one that is very close to me, and I think that Pat Bro knows about because of his work up in the north. We are facing, by the latest report of the Pentagon, who know this business, that the most severe security threat the world faces is climate change taking place. And that the most evident place where the canary is in the mine shaft is in the northern circumpolar areas of this world, where the United States, Canada, the Nordic countries, Russia, are all finding a collapse going on in the sort of ability to sustain life and vegetation and animal life, and where the levels of fresh water are now rapidly increasing. The flow of fresh water coming out of the Hudson's Bay Strait and is now beginning to match up with the Gulf Stream that's moving up, fundamentally changing ocean patterns. That the waters are opening up for navigation. That there will be serious interest. The Russians are much further ahead than we are in developing plans for major transportation shipping through that area. We're opening up a whole new area of the world, and there's no governance. There's nobody exercising any responsibility to protect the people or the polar bears, and not only that, but everybody else. And I suspect, I don't know how high up this university is, but we're staying in a hotel on the Pacific coast, and I suppose 5 years from now we might find ourselves lapping at the bedpost. It's because simply those levels are changing. And there is a classic case, and there's many of them. It's a classic case that no one country is responsible. It's no one administration is responsible. It's all of us. It is a real responsibility to protect, but there's no ability to do it. Which takes me to the third idea, and because I know that we have a certain religious history, this is what I would call the New Testament of security. You go from human security to responsibility to protect to what I really call the global public domain, where you begin to extend and elaborate, not world government, but the responsibility to build internationally, globally, a set of institutions and practices, and they can be universities, and they can be business associations, and the role of corporations, where there is an attempt or effort to say there are standards, and there's rules, and there's practices, that where there are issues that we all face as one, interdependently, that we have to make some decisions about this, about how we exercise our joint responsibility. And the further we ignore it, and the more that we put it aside. I mean, I'm not here to do history, but remember that the United States has been one of the most successful, if not the most successful, country in building a public domain. Of saying, we work by the market, but there are certain rules the market works by. There are certain restraints on the role of government. There are certain ways that people participate. There are certain ways that we make sure that decisions, when they have to be done collectively, are shared. Our own country's the same. Many countries in Europe are. There's movements towards democracy that make that happen. People have built successful public domains nationally behind their borders. Issue is, can we build the same sense of domain, of public interest and public responsibility on a global level? That is the question that many of the young people sitting in this audience tonight are going to have to answer. It's the kind of challenge that I see in my own university. We've just set up a thing called the Global College, which is an attempt to reach out and say, okay, all we can do is pass on some of our angst and anxieties because we don't have the answers, but can you really begin to apply that notion of a public domain, a global public domain, eventually to the management and governance of security? Security in all its dimensions: pandemics, diseases, environmental calamities, and regard the pain of others, which increasingly becomes our pain, in Susan Sontag's word. So that's, if you like, is to use a word, truth-speaking from your northern neighbor. We think it is time we built a public domain. We can't do it without the United States. You are the anchor of any new efforts to build a public domain because of the power and the history and experience. And we certainly don't pretend that we're not a big military power. We have no sense of manifest destiny. We don't carry sticks. But we do believe that there are ideas and interests and collaboration that we can make, and that within this North American context we can work ultimately together. If not from Ottawa to Washington, from California to Manitoba, from business group to business group, from labor union to labor union, from student to student, from university to university, to find those answers. Because that's what the public domain is about. It's not just government, it's networks of people and institutions and organizations and associations that allow us all to maintain. When I read President Bush's inauguration speech, State of the Union, about we must dedicate ourselves to the pursuit of liberty. Great. Whose liberty? And what happens to the Inuit of my country and your country who are losing their freedom to survive because of policies being made around the world? How do we share our technology as North Americans with China and India, which are findings, which are on a huge growth trajectory, but they're going to need some answers from us about how we can, whether it's applying new gasification techniques for coal, or whether it's providing efforts to provide emissions control, where California is taking the lead. There's a lot of things we can start not only doing for ourselves, but beginning to share with a lot of others. And that is really, I guess, what keeps me sort of in the game, because I really do think that we're on the eclipse of that kind of opportunity. Let me just close with an old, going back to university, I acquired a new technology myself. I learned to read. And I went back to a 1948 inaugural address by a well-known Canadian economist called Harold Innis. He is the head of the Royal Society, which is a group of scientists and academics. And I was struck by the title. It's called Minerva's Owl. Probably some of the philosophers in the room know what Minerva's Owl is about, but there's an old philosophical saying that Minerva's owl flies at dusk, which means once you see it, it's too late to do anything about it. That you're responding and reacting too late. You're not in the front of the curve, you're behind the curve. And I think we're increasingly guilty of watching Minerva's owl fly at dusk. The real issue, and I think maybe it starts in places like this, is when can we see Minerva's owl fly at dawn? That's the time when we begin to meld and morph from human security to responsibility to protect to a global public domain. Thank you very much.